The officer Harper raised his hand to silence a pregnant woman on the street. He had no idea her husband was about to walk into his life as the one man who could end his career. A single slap changed everything. Harper thought he was just dealing with a loud civilian. The shocking twist leaves him speechless, and the consequences are unforgettable. Watch till the end. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insane stories. The incident started on a Tuesday afternoon when Officer Daniel Harper was patrolling the east side of town. He had been with the police department for 8 years, a man known for his quick temper and firm belief in maintaining order. That day, he was driving his usual route, keeping an eye on the streets. Harper slowed his patrol car, watching her for a moment. Her name was Emily Carter, though he didn't know that yet. She was 32 years old, 7 months pregnant, and arguing with her mother about a family matter that had been simmering for weeks. Emily's voice grew louder as she gestured with her free hand, pacing back and forth near the edge of the sidewalk. Harper decided it was time to intervene. He pulled his car to the curb, stepped out, and adjusted his belt as he approached her. He called out to her, asking what the problem was, but Emily didn't hear him at first. She was too caught up in her conversation, her frustration spilling out with every word. Harper repeated himself, his tone sharper this time, and when she still didn't respond, he stepped closer, raising his voice to get her attention. Emily finally turned, startled to see an officer standing there. She lowered her phone, explaining that she was just talking to her mother and that it wasn't any of his business. Harper didn't like her tone. He told her she was causing a disturbance, that people were staring, and that she needed to calm down. Emily frowned, pointing out that she wasn't breaking any laws, just standing on a public sidewalk. Her words came out fast, her pregnancy making her more emotional than usual, and Harper took it as defiance. He told her to lower her voice or he'd have to take her in. Emily laughed, not out of disrespect, but disbelief, and asked what he could possibly arrest her for. Harper's face tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not in public, where a small crowd had started to gather. He stepped forward, telling her she was resisting an officer now, and when she took a step back, holding her belly protectively, he reached out and slapped her across the face. The sound cut through the air, sharp and unmistakable. Emily stumbled, her hand flying to her cheek. The phone dropped from her other hand, clattering to the ground. She stared at Harper in shock, tears welling up as the sting spread across her skin. The onlookers gasped, some pulling out their phones to record, others murmuring in disbelief. Harper froze for a second, realizing what he'd done, but then doubled down, telling her she shouldn't have pushed him to that point. Emily didn't respond. She just stood there, trembling, trying to process what had happened. A man from the crowd stepped forward, asking Harper what he thought he was doing, but Harper waved him off, saying it was police business. Emily bent down slowly, wincing as she picked up her phone. The screen was cracked, but she didn't care about that. She dialed her husband, Michael Carter, her hand shaking as she pressed the buttons. Michael picked up on the second ring, and before he could say much, Emily was sobbing, telling him a cop had just hit her. Michael was at his desk when the call came. He was 35, a calm and methodical man who had just started a new job that week as the deputy chief of police. He'd moved to the city with Emily a month earlier, leaving behind a smaller department where he'd worked for years. His first few days had been busy with meetings and paperwork, so he hadn't met most of the officers yet, including Harper. When Emily's voice came through the phone, panicked and broken, Michael felt his chest tighten. He asked her where she was, told her to stay put, and said he was coming right away. Back at the scene, Harper was trying to regain control. He told the crowd to disperse, threatening to call for backup if they didn't. A few people backed off, but others stayed, still filming. Emily stood off to the side, clutching her phone, her cheek red where Harper had struck her. She kept repeating to herself that this couldn't be happening, that she was pregnant, that she hadn't done anything wrong. Her mind raced, wondering if the slap could have hurt the baby, though she didn't feel any pain beyond her face. Michael arrived 15 minutes later, pulling up in his unmarked car. He stepped out wearing a suit instead of a uniform, which confused Harper at first. Michael saw Emily immediately, her tear-streaked face and the way she held her stomach, and he rushed over to her. She collapsed into his arms, telling him everything. how she'd been on the phone, how the officer had demanded she stop, how he'd hit her when she didn't comply fast enough. Michael listened, his jaw clenching tighter with every word. He turned to Harper, who was still standing there, arms crossed, looking defiant. Michael asked him what had happened, keeping his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. Harper explained that Emily had been disorderly, that she'd resisted his instructions, and that he'd had to take action. He didn't apologize, didn't back down, just stated it like it was fact. Michael asked for his name and badge number, and Harper gave them without hesitation. Daniel Harper, 4729, assuming Michael was just a concerned citizen who'd file a complaint that wouldn't go anywhere. Michael didn't say who he was at first. He told Harper to stay where he was, then walked Emily to his car, helping her into the passenger seat. She was still crying, asking why this had happened, and Michael promised her he'd handle it. He called the station from his phone, requesting an internal affairs officer and a supervisor to come to the scene. Harper watched from a distance, starting to sense that something was off, but he didn't know the full scope yet. The supervisor, Lieutenant Karen Ellis, arrived 20 minutes later with an eye investigator named Paul Grayson. Ellis had been with the department for 12 years and knew Harper well. He had been disciplined twice before for excessive force, though never anything this public. She approached Harper first, asking for his side of the story. He repeated what he had told Michael, adding that the woman had been hysterical and that he had acted to de-escalate. Ellis raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment, just took notes. Grayson went to talk to Emily, who was still in Michael's car. She told him everything, her voice shaky but clear, and showed him the mark on her face. Grayson asked if she wanted to press charges, and she said yes, without hesitation. Michael stood nearby, watching the crowd, some of whom were still filming. He stepped over to Ellis and introduced himself, showing her his ID. Her eyes widened slightly when she realized who he was, Deputy Chief Michael Carter, her new boss, and Harper's too. Ellis called Harper over and asked when he saw Michael's face up close. Harper didn't recognize him, but he caught the way Ellis deferred to him, and a knot formed in his stomach. Michael told Harper he was suspended, effective immediately, pending an investigation. Harper blinked, asking why, and Michael said it was because he'd assaulted a civilian, his wife, in fact. The words hung in the air, and Harper's expression shifted from confusion to dread. He opened his mouth to argue, but Ellis cut him off, telling him to hand over his badge and gun. Harper complied, his hands moving slowly as the reality sank in. He asked Michael if this was personal now, and Michael said it wasn't. It was protocol. But his tone made it clear he wasn't going to let this slide. Ellis escorted Harper to her car, telling him he'd be driven back to the station to give a formal statement. The crowd watched, some cheering, others whispering as Harper climbed into the back seat. Grayson finished taking Emily's statement and told her she needed to come to the station later to file an official report. She nodded, still holding Michael's hand. He drove her home after that, promising again that he'd make sure Harper faced consequences. Emily didn't say much on the ride, just stared out the window, replaying the moment in her head. When they got home, she went straight to bed, exhausted and overwhelmed, while Michael sat in the living room thinking about what came next. At the station, Harper sat in a small room, waiting for the IA interview. He told himself he'd done nothing wrong, that he'd been provoked, but the memory of Michael's face and the fact that he was the new deputy chief kept gnawing at him. Ellis came in first, asking him to walk her through it again. Harper stuck to his story, but his confidence was slipping. Grayson joined them, bringing witness statements from the crowd and video footage that had already started circulating online. The footage showed everything. Emily arguing on the phone, Harper approaching, the slap, her reaction. There was no audio, but the visuals were damning. Harper watched it, his face paling, and tried to explain that it looked worse than it was. Grayson didn't respond. Just asked if he'd ever met Michael Carter before. Harper said no, and Grayson nodded, letting the silence stretch. Michael spent the next few hours at home checking on Emily and making calls. He spoke to the police chief, a man named Robert Gaines, who'd hired him. Gaines was furious when he heard what had happened, promising a full investigation and asking Michael to stay out of it to avoid bias. Michael agreed, but only because he trusted Gaines to follow through. He also called a lawyer friend, David Patel, to start working on a civil case against Harper and the department. By evening, the story was spreading. Local news picked it up after the videos hit social media, and people were outraged. The headline read, "Officer slaps pregnant woman in broad daylight." And the comments online demanded Harper's badge. Some dug into his past, finding the prior complaints, and the pressure on the department grew. Gaines issued a statement that night, saying the officer was suspended and that they were investigating thoroughly. Emily woke up around 8 p.m., feeling a little better but still shaken. She sat with Michael in the kitchen, eating soup he'd made, and asked what would happen to Harper. Michael said he'd likely be fired, maybe charged, depending on what IA found. Emily nodded, then asked if this would follow them now with his new job. Michael admitted it might, but he said he didn't care. He just wanted her and the baby safe. The next day, Harper was called back to the station. Grayson and Ellis laid out the evidence. Emily's statement, the witness accounts, the video, his own history. They asked if he wanted to change anything in his story, and he didn't. He stuck to his version, saying he'd felt threatened, though he couldn't explain why. Grayson told him the investigation would wrap up soon and then it'd go to the chief and Michael for a decision. Michael went into the office that morning, his first full day since the incident. People stared as he walked in, some whispering, others avoiding his gaze. He met with Gaines, who showed him the footage. Michael watched it silently, his hands clenched under the table. Gaines asked what he thought, and Michael said Harper shouldn't wear a badge again. Gaines agreed, but said they had to wait for IA to finish. Emily went to the doctor that afternoon just to be sure the baby was okay. The ultrasound showed everything was fine and she felt a weight lift. She texted Michael the news and he called her back relieved. They talked for a while and she said she wanted Harper to face more than just losing his job. She wanted him in court. Michael said David was already on it, that they'd sue if the criminal case didn't stick. Over the next week, the investigation moved fast. Grayson interviewed more witnesses, confirmed the video wasn't tampered with, and wrote up his report. The next week, Grayson interviewed more witnesses, confirmed the video wasn't tampered with, and wrote up his report. He concluded Harper had used unjustified force, violated policy, and lied about feeling threatened. Ellis added her own notes, saying Harper's record showed a pattern. They sent it to Gaines on Friday, and he called Michael in to review it. Michael read the report, every word burning into him. He saw the recommendation, termination, and possible charges and told Gaines he supported it. Gaines signed off, and by Monday, Harper was officially fired. The DA's office got the case that afternoon, reviewing it for assault charges. Harper got the call at home, sitting on his couch, staring at the wall. He didn't react at first, just hung up and sat there knowing it wasn't over. The news broke that evening. Harper was out, and people cheered online. But some defended him, saying Emily shouldn't have argued, that cops had tough jobs. It split the city, debates flaring up everywhere. Emily saw it on her phone and felt sick, wondering if she'd ever escape the story. Michael told her to ignore it, that they'd get through it together. A month later, the DA charged Harper with misdemeanor assault. He pleaded not guilty, hiring a lawyer who argued self-defense. The trial was set for 3 months out, and Michael and Emily started preparing with David for their civil suit. Harper moved out of town, staying with a cousin, avoiding the stares and whispers. He told himself he'd fight it, that he was the villain here, but the video kept playing in his head. Emily gave birth 2 months after that, a healthy girl they named Lily. Michael was there, holding her hand, and for a while they focused on her, letting the case fade into the background, but it never fully left. The trial came and Harper lost. 6 months probation and a fine. The civil suit settled a year later, the department paying out, though Harper didn't contribute much. He never worked as a cop again, drifting between jobs while Michael rose in the ranks, determined to change things from the inside. Emily healed, physically at least, but she'd tense up whenever she saw a patrol car. She told Michael once that she didn't regret fighting back, and he said he was proud of her. They moved forward, raising Lily, but the story lingered, a moment that shaped them and the city in ways none of them had expected.